Well, hello everybody, and welcome to our webinar. I'll say good morning. I'm out in Southern California. It's about 9 o'clock here, but I know we're all over the world, which just makes this very exciting. I want to thank EUROPAST for hosting this webinar on this new publication we have, and I do have it right here for all of you who you can see this. So there's the publication on defending memory on global politics. My name is Doug Becker. I am at the University of Southern California, and I'm actually here in sort of three different capacities. First of all, I do host a podcast and radio show called Scholar's Circle. The whole idea is to take academic research and elevate our political discourses, and it's very much in that spirit that we're hosting this webinar. I'm also one of the authors of this edited volume. My piece is on the United States, and I can tell you, from the U.S., at this point, this idea of memory conflicts, conflicts over memories, conflicts over identities, seems particularly salient the last few weeks. My own work on the U.S. Confederacy, on Confederate statues, renaming of bases. Actually, one of the bases I talked about, Fort Bragg, that had its name changed to Fort Liberty. Apparently that was too woke. And so now we're back to Fort Bragg, named after Braxton Bragg, the Confederate general, a couple of weeks ago. I wish it wasn't the topic wasn't as salient as it is, but it seems like that it is. So, but actually, the biggest reason why I'm here is I'm one of the editors of this piece. And I got to tell you, first of all, the process of editing, it's the first time I've edited a volume, that the opportunity to work with my two colleagues, with Dovile and with Erica, they are two of the most insightful and incisive academics, wonderful researchers, great editors, but also just incredibly generous colleagues and dear friends. So thank you. I want to thank you for, this is their third together. Getting me the opportunity to join them was just one of the highlights of my career. This is a book about mnemonic conflicts, about conflicts over memory, the impact that it has on identities in international politics, state actors, sub-state actors, inspired by a piece that we all read and really altered the way we think about this, written by Maria Mälksoo, who's going to talk to us about that in just a moment. I do want to share with you, Maria, that I presented my chapter a couple of years ago, and Brent Steele, colleague of ours, we both know well, was the discussant and chair, and he looked at me and he said, "That piece Maria wrote, oh, it's really changed a lot of minds, hasn't it?" And I just kind of nodded and said, absolutely. So this book is at least in part an homage to you and that piece that you wrote, because what we wanted to do with this is to develop case studies around it, to show how this works in specific cases. And I'm a huge proponent of case studies, both from an academic perspective, from a pedagogical perspective, to show the critical lens that you introduced, and then how this plays, and how this plays out. So what we're going to do today, I'm going to start off with Maria telling us a bit about that piece. What is the theory behind the piece? What was the inspiration behind it? And then have three of our authors who've developed case studies talk a bit about those cases. And I suspect they're just going to scratch the surface of some of these cases. So it's an invitation, please read the book, because it's these chapters are really rather remarkable. And I would like to finish up by saying I got the opportunity to teach a undergraduate research seminar on this topic because the book had come out, and so I had 13 students each producing their own work. So I'm hoping we get a few more publications and cases coming out of coming out of that, because quite frankly, I think this topic is so salient. The theory is so insightful and inspirational. So with that, I'm going to turn things over to Maria Mälksoo. She's from the University of Copenhagen, and quite frankly, the inspiration to for this and for the book. Maria, thank you. First of all, thank you so much for the chapter. Tell us a bit about what inspired the chapter.
Thanks so much, Douglas. I mean, this is all too kind, and I'm completely not prepared for such a flowering introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Good evening, everyone. And I'm here really to just to celebrate with you. I have the book with me here. I had the honor and the pleasure to write a very brief preface to it, and indeed, to my great happy surprise, it was very nice to see how the book sort of uses my now 10-year-old article that was published in Security Dialogue, Memory Must Be Defended, with a sort of at least implicit question mark, that sort of developed the notion of mnemonic security and what happens if memory gets securitized, and what are the related pitfalls and what is the price. That book that you have now achieved together, indeed third in a row, is taking this in all sorts of very interesting and indeed exotic empirical directions, which I think is also one of its main assets. And I really would like to, first of all, congratulate you all, because as I think this now at least trilogy, right, that you have in various constellations of editors put together, as this attests, you have established a very vibrant scholarly community and scholarly circle, and clearly something is working well, because these books keep popping out. And I'm also glad in a way that that even if I've been at the sidelines of your collaboration, I've always had some connection with your circle, either via conference panels. I remember that I could not say yes to Dovile and Erika when you put together the first volume in the series, which was basically a theoretical stock taking on memory and trauma and international relations, because I had my first child at the time, and I wanted to sort of dedicate the time accordingly. But there we are now, and I guess we are all in one way or the other related. And I think what really fascinated me about the book are the unusual cases. I mean, the richness of them, the quite unexplored fringes, and that applies really across the board, not just going to what we refer to as the global south, but actually, I'm not always sure the global south recognizes itself there, or agrees that there is a single global south. There is quite a bit of variety, and the studies, say from Colombia and Brazil, but also the U.S. case itself from southern U.S. attest to that. And then we have all these very exotic cases in the book from Europe and Asia, which I think also you do not usually encounter in the meeting point, or at the meeting point of international relations and memory studies, such as Chechnya, for instance, and of course enriching further our picture of what's going on in the Baltic states. And I mean, I could continue with the praise for a long time. I think there is a lot for all sorts of readerships, because you do also, which is commendable and not always so easily achieved, you take the conversation away and beyond the pretty standard state-centric discussion, standard in international relations, which would be, my and I guess many of your home fields. And I think this is only commendable. I mean, there's a lot going on there in the book also on non-state actors and how they try to securitize or how they try to defend memory, plus the transnational dimension, of course. And there are also, for those who are more conceptually geared, perhaps, all different kinds of memories featuring in the book. I mean, there's a gender dimension there, and all sorts of memory entrepreneurships going on, plus the grand themes that we always are, attuned to when we are interested in memory and identity, such as who's accountable and who's guilty, and how the processes of forgetting and mourning go on. So I have to only resonate with what Douglas already said, that nothing can be helped here but to read the rich book and enjoy the case studies, and I'll pass it on to the authors so that they could introduce their oeuvre. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Maria. I'm going to turn to Fabrizio. Fabrizio Chigas Bastos, currently at Harvard University. Tell us a little bit about your chapter.
Thank you, Doug. I have a quick presentation that should, yeah, well, of course, it's not going to work now, but whatever. Okay, so the chapter I wrote with a good friend, former PhD student and colonel of the Colombia Air Force, Maria Mälksoo, is about a very specific chapter of the Colombian history. And I had a beautiful photo of the palace here, but this year we have the anniversary of 30 years of the take of the Palace of Justice in November 1985. As you may know, Colombia is a peculiar place for studying memory because after about 6 decades of continuous war, the memory itself is something that is at war. You have parts of the country, for instance, as we showed in the chapter, the army controlling the idea of the past as something dangerous, using what the Prussian army, in fact, called the theory of the stab in the back, because they fear that they would be blamed for all the problems happen in the country. On the other hand, you have a number of social actors attempting to dispute the idea of memory because of the ones who disappear during this specific event, or the guerrilla who want to have a voice and bring their experience to society, to the peace process. What's fascinating out of this case, when Maria mentioned a couple of minutes ago the idea of securitizing memory, we managed to find that in Colombia, apparently the past, not only the memory, but the past became something dangerous. The idea of remembering, using memory, became something dangerous for the military, for part of the military, and for part of the state. So at that time, in the 3-4 days that followed this taking of the Palace of Justice, very briefly, I'm sorry, what happened was the guerrilla group invaded the Palace of Justice. The army entered, killed everyone, kidnapped a number of other people, and left. And on the other side of the square, the generals came to the president. In 12 hours, they staged a coup, removed the presidential powers, took the decisions, put the presidential powers back in place, and made Belisario Betancourt sign the actions justifying the heavy measures they took as extraordinary measures and exempting the army out of it. So that's the context of this. I'm sorry, I didn't mention that first. So what we found looking at this specific case is that the changes at that time, because the past was securitized, not only the memory, the disputes that were born in 85, for instance, changed the constitution in 1990. It changed a generation of Supreme Court justice. It changed the way the peace process unfolded years later. And it changed the way the army positions itself still today. So Rodrigo, my co-author, a colonel of the Air Force, is the head of the negotiations with the ELN, the last guerrilla group. The way he has to behave is strongly attached to that idea of the memory being disputed between the army, the social forces, and the state today. So just to wrap up, I think I'm going over my time. What we see in this idea, and this is what I mentioned in the chapter, I called it the Mälksoo-Zefus continuum, Zefus-Mälksoo continuum, is that there's a dispute between those who want to forget what happened and those who insist and defend the remembrance as something that, because the war is still ongoing, is something that must be defended, something that must be put in place because the memory didn't turn into history yet. And that dispute is still ongoing, is the mother of, for instance, what in the end became the Special Justice for Peace. So it's something that, even though we have this happen 30 years ago, it's still very present, and those disputes are still ongoing. It's a fascinating case. And to wrap up, different from other cases in the South, as Maria mentioned, for instance, or in South America, to be more specific, such as what Erica's going to talk in a couple of minutes, or the Chilean case or the Argentinian case, it's not something that was settled. The dispute from memory happens every day in the judicial cases that are ongoing now. It happens when the army finds a new false positive cemetery, or when political forces are disputing Congress. So the idea of securitizing memory, securitizing past, is a daily task, is a daily dispute in Colombia. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabrizio. You actually highlight two huge questions, I think, and sometimes we think about memory as being different types of memory, but frequently the conflict is over remembrance versus forgetting. I think is an essential component there too. The other is these are never resolved. These are always ongoing political dramas. I always like to tell my students the hardest thing about following these cases is sort of like joining the movie halfway in. And so our job is to get you caught up, and then you can continue to follow it and show your insights. I mentioned the movie because we're going to turn things over to Didem Bahari. She is at İzmir Kachip Çelebi University in Turkey, and she's going to tell us a bit about her chapter, which, at least in part, is about a film.
Thank you very much, Doug. Can you see my PowerPoint slides? Thank you. Okay, so my chapter is about cultural diplomacy of a Crimean diaspora, Crimean Tatar diaspora, in order to defend their own version of history against Russian accusations of mass treason and Nazi collaboration. And as you know, they were deported in 1944, and my work builds on a previous comparative work. I collaborated with Dovila Budrite on the comparison of two different narratives of victimhood in Crimean Tatar diaspora and Lithuanian American diasporas through historical films. And I've been inspired and influenced by Maria Mälksoo's work, Bahar Rumeli's work on securitization, and which also introduced me to Paul Tillich's different types of anxieties. And I'm really so grateful to collaborate with you for so many years. And I learned a lot about both theory and memory, defending memory, and also about Crimean Tatars from many different authors who contributed. Nikolko, for example, and Claudio Tatar, who also contributed on Crimean Tatar case in this excellent volume. So I tried to differ from my previous work by distinguishing between offensive and defensive strategies in mnemonic conflicts. So I tried to use these different types of anxieties, and I said offensive mnemonic strategies, attacks against other, rival powers in order to weaken their stance and their cause, and justify violence against them and discredit them by propagating a certain version of historical narrative, saying that they are fake, they are artificially constructed, their identity is not authentic, So they do not have a right to equal sovereignty. They do not have any true agency. They are a puppet in the hands of, some manipulators. And the offender has a right to take back certain lands from that rival because of the historical facts. And also the condemnation anxiety plays an important role in this offense, reviving also self-doubt in the rival community about whether they are on the right side of the history, whether they were really victim and right in a conflict such as the Second World War. And the defensive strategies were, of course, about countering these historical accusations and trying to survive against these both physical attacks, violence, and also some historical narratives that try to discredit them, their identity, their authenticity, and their narrative of victimhood. And they also try to prevent, of course, the triggering of these anxieties in their community, especially in younger generations, which would, of course, prevent their mobilization against an external attack. So, of course, I encountered the problem of deciding who is on the offense, who is on the defense, because this mnemonic security dilemma plays an important role in this, especially mnemonic conflict between Russia and the West, or Western-supported Ukraine. And as we know, the Russian discourse, the West is usually depicted as manipulating history and propagating anti-Russian version of history. And Russia tries to justify its memory loss as a response to the decommunization laws in the post-Soviet people, societies manipulated by the Western ideologues. And we also see the EU as a side to this conflict, which is concerned about Russian distortion of historical facts and attempt to whitewash crimes committed by the Soviet totalitarian regime, and also trying to spread some disinformation in order to divide Europe and Europeans. So my aim was to determine who was the offensive actor in this game. And I thought we should first look at the territorial aggrandizement attempt of a certain actor. So I ask, who is weaponizing history in order to justify violence against another nation and against the territorial unity and ontological security of another nation. And I also try to consider the power imbalance between the actors when I try to determine the offensive side, because when I look at the mnemonic conflict between the Russian state and a small Crimean Tatar diaspora, I saw that, Crimean Tatar narratives, commemorative events, leadership, representative institutions, they were all banned, and the Russian state is on the powerful side, and it bans the Crimean Tatar political activism under the anti-terrorism law of Russia after the annexation. So Crimean Tatars, focus on Crimean Tatars is important because they have become very visible after the annexation in this mnemonic conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Ukraine has recognized the Crimean Tatar deportation of 1944 as genocide and is propagating it in the West, which is supported also by the Western powers. And Russia is claiming that Ukraine and the West are manipulating also the current situation of Crimean Tatars, and they are playing the Crimean Tatar card, exaggerating the suffering of the Crimean Tatars in order to discredit Russian power. So Crimean Tatars are in between fires, caught between fires, and their cultural diplomacy is seen as anti-Russian. A film they made, a Crimean Tatar diaspora in Ukraine, with the support of the Western powers and Ukraine. This film aims to counter these historical accusations of Russia about, Crimean Tatar mass treason and, Nazi ideology. So High Time, I looked at High Time, the historical film on the deportation of Crimean Tatars, which is based on a true story of a Soviet aviator who is a decorated soldier in the Soviet army and who witnessed the deportation. So the film's cast also includes some real survivors of the deportation of 1944. And this film was also promoted by Ukrainian embassies, Turkish embassies in different parts of the world. And it is banned in Russia for distorting history. And when I looked at the film, I looked at different strategies of defending memory in order to counter Russian accusations and condemnation against Crimean Tatars. So we see that the choice of the main character makes a sense, is meaningful, because it's a loyalist to Stalin. His father is raising his glass in this scene, for example, to a victory of Stalin and Soviets. But the film shows that Crimean Tatars are shocked when they were deported one night without any notice by the Soviet authorities and accused of mass treason. So these are some scenes which show that Ahmet Sultan, the Soviet aviator's father, was harassed by the Soviet secret police, and Soviets were very merciless. And he was still in shock, and he didn't believe that Stalin knew all these things. He was still loyal, according to the film. And we also see another strategy trying to prove historical injustice endured by the Crimean Tatars, innocent civilians, loyal citizens of Soviets, and elderly, children, women, decorated soldiers. They were all shot in the back, deported, murdered mercilessly in the film. So these scenes show the Soviets as very violent and very merciless against Crimean Tatars. And we also see some strategies of defending memory in order to counter claims of inauthenticity. They try to show that they are different from Russians and Ukrainians in terms of cultural identity, religious identity. Even the name of the film, Haytarma, is the name of a Crimean Tatar folk dance. And you see some rituals, ceremonies throughout the film, like kissing the hands of the elderly, wearing Crimean Tatar traditional costumes, dresses, and some rituals. And speaking of Crimean Tatar, in this scene, for example, the woman who was taken to the train station for deportation, she was crying because her kid was sleeping in the house, but she was speaking in Crimean Tatar language. That's why the Soviet secret police didn't understand her. And another scene is very influential because an elderly Crimean Tatar woman who is about to be taken to the train station, she says she just needs God, a Quran, a memory, a photo of the family, and bread, a piece of bread for survival. So this looks like a message to the younger generations of Crimean Tatars. And the film ends with this scene, which shows the main character disillusioned, disappointed, betrayed by the Soviet authorities, and having lost separated from his lover, his family. And the film also shows some statistics about, many people who lost their lives, more than 100,000 people, half of the population at that time of the Crimean Tatars, lost their lives during the deportation. And 7 Crimean Tatars were given the title of a hero of the USSR. So they tried to show that the Soviet historical injustice is still ongoing. It's not recognized, acknowledged by the Russians, and Russian leadership is trying to justify violence against them by using their own historical narrative. So I want to end here. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much. And I think the impact of film. I also think of when I think of the Crimean Tatars, excuse me. I always think of Jamila, and winning Eurovision by reminding us of this as well. A really interesting interesting piece. We're going to turn things over to Erica Resende. Obviously one of the editors. Also, she's going to talk about her chapter. She's still at the Brazilian War College officially, but she's been off in France for the last couple of years, as well. Erica, the floor is yours.
Yeah, hello. I hope everybody's hearing me. I tried my personal computer. It didn't work out. I switched to the laptop. It didn't work out. Now I'm finally back on the cell phone. And so here I'm speaking to you from Rio de Janeiro, a city currently under fire because we are experiencing a heat wave of 42 degrees Celsius, which is pretty much around 110 Fahrenheit. But this also makes me pinch the notion that from the Global South, we have also some very interesting contributions to the debate on memory politics, memory activists, and in the so-called broadly conceived as a mnemonic turn in international relations. So, and the contribution that I wanted, me and my writing partner, Isadora Xavier, was to introduce especially to audience from the North, a very interesting social movement that it's grounded on memory activism, in fact, which is the Mothers of Acari. And why the case actually talks about mothers and daughters that decided to take action against a phenomenon that pretty much keeps going on. So there's a continuum here, although the case began at the end of the military regime in Brazil, so pre-redemocratization, but the phenomenon still goes on in post-democratization, which is police violence. And more specifically, death squads. So groups composed of current, active, and former police officers, as well as there was 2 cases of firemen. So broadly conceived state agents that were in a way making up a so-called militarization of police force and police services in Brazil. So for us in the Global South, talking about militarization has a slightly different meaning, which is not much as how the notion of a preparedness for war pervades through society, but more the fact of how military as well as military thinking and doctrines are constantly used, reused, and employed in other normal political domains such as public safety. And so the notion how military men and military thinking and the military, they have a role or expected to play a role outside the traditional scope of defense. And so this happened in the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro in the early 1980s, when a group of this members, they invaded a private barbecue park and took away a group of roughly 15 young people, you know, teenagers, and they vanished. So there's also the dimension here of missing bodies. So the longer how there are no bodies, so there's no death. And these mothers, they took on against this militarized, you know, state in Brazil to demand an accountability of where are the bodies. We have the right to mourn. We have the right to bury those ones, the loved ones. And not only they wanted to, not as much as to find who did it, but they took it very deeply, the notion that they have to be issued death certificates saying that the state killed those loved ones. So it's not about receiving financial compensations in a way. It's not as much as the state acknowledging death squads do exist and those disappearances and the disappearances, but for the state to take responsibility and to change that death certificates from general, you know, disappearances of, but murder by the state. And this particular case, I think it's also very interesting because it talks about this continuum still in Brazil between pre-democratization and post-democratization. So the acts of violence between against minorities in the outskirts still goes on even in democratic times. Also very interesting is the notion of intersection between class, race, and gender. So poor women from the outskirts of Rio de Janeiro, very low income, and predominantly Black women. So they are wanting the state to also look into the fact that there is a so-called genocide of young Black people, especially young Black men in the outskirts of the Brazilian big cities. A third dimension that I thought was particularly interesting is how this movement of women gain momentum and gain visibility through actions of memory activism. So women presenting themselves as mothers, wives, and daughters of those disappeared. And they performed their social demands very clearly towards an acknowledgement of the state that those people were taken, the disappearance, the bodies have to be found, and the death certificates reissued, much more than just found who did it. So it talks about the resiliency of this particular social actors by defending the memory of their own beloved ones, always framing them as being victims of death squads and this highly violent police enforcement policies, as well as having the right to mourn and the right to give a proper burial for the loved ones, and those loved ones not to be understood as, you know, they were like bandits or punks of that were caught and taken away. No, they were working people, but still they had jobs and their families. They were not, so what you usually, which is the official discourse by state agents in Brazil, oh, those were the bad guys, so they were killed, nobody's gonna mourn it. So to go against and defend the memories of their loved ones was a very key element, component of their performance. And how they were able to, one specific case, which is the Mothers of Acari, which is an outskirt of Rio, were able to reach out and build bridges with other cases, very similar ones of death squads in the outskirts in Brazilian cities. So that allowed for a whole social movement of mothers to emerge. So multiple ones in the outskirts of São Paulo, Brasilia, Salvador, not only Rio de Janeiro, all of them presenting themselves as mothers of a particular place where the death squad and the disappearance and killings happen. And the ongoing, I'm talking about a movement that pretty much is ongoing since early 1980s. So we're talking in roughly almost about 50 years of memory activism, which I think is phenomenal. And how they were actually then able to get important gains of acknowledgements by the Brazilian state. First one was the reissue of death certificates, a change in policy regarding the persecution of police officials that took part in those death squads group. Although the time for persecution officially timed out, but symbolically the acknowledgement that the state was negligent in not persecuting those police officers who did the killing. And more recently, and I'm talking about pretty much like 4 days after the book came out, Brazil was finally condemned by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights in this particular instance. So that was taken to the Inter-American system of human rights protection, and Brazil was found guilty of allowing death squads operated by police force, state agents to operate, and Brazil having failed to persecute and defend those women. So Brazil was condemned to create a permanent body within the public prosecutors to track and reissue death certificates to cases that had similar characteristics, as well as the official creation of memorials to mark the sites of the death squads and the people who were killed and were forced disappearance, as well as the creation of school programs, and particular 1 week here in the state of Rio de Janeiro dedicated to the victims of police force, where women, daughters, and wives of disappeared and those who have suffered police violence are invited to come to the city council and deliver their testimonies. So I think the case in itself, it's very rich, because it allows us, those who are working with critical security studies like myself, to pull a thread and question things like this intersection of race, class, and gender. It allows us to think about the redemocratization, pre-democratization, a continuum in specifically into police force. Allows us as well to look into the resilience of women's movement and how, even if they're conceptually conceived to be a weaker part, women, outskirts, Black women, having most of them were not even educated, beyond, and even like mid-level of elementary school, but how they were actually able to have an effect and impact policies, both at the city, state, and federal level. And finally, even talking about the subsystem where Brazil was, was condemned for not, for being negligent and not acting. So I think it's a very interesting case that sheds light into something that I think it's very common in the global South, but not talked much about or looked into from the North. And finally, just some thoughts about the book itself. Memory issues, memory politics. I think it allows, it provides a lens to us to look into phenomena that are happening globally. So I was very happy that we were able to mobilize contributors working and presenting cases of far from your usual sites where you look into memory politics. So not only from Latin America, but contributions from Asia and Africa, Middle East, as well as Central and Eastern European states. So I was very, very happy for this labor of work. It took us 3-4 long years, but I'm grateful for those who worked with us and who were willing to take this book into this final result. So I'm just going to finish it up here.
Oh, thank you, Erica. And the other memory aspect I just want to highlight with yours is that I found particularly fascinating is the way in which you draw the parallels to human rights activism under the military regimes and the continuation, you know, under the democratic regimes. That's the whole, you know, those of us who aren't necessarily, you know, Latin American specialists, but know of the Mothers of the Plaza, the way that got framed in your chapter, I thought was really a very interesting use of, you know, of memory and memory discourse. So, Violetta Davo-Liucci of Vilnius University, Dovile Budrite of Georgia Gwinett, you're going to serve as our discussants. Violetta, I'm going to turn it over to you to make a few comments on the chapters and on the presentations, then finish up with Dovile, and then we should have, you know, plenty of time for questions. So all of you in the audience, if you'd like to ask the question, just raise your hand. You can post it in the chat if you'd prefer not to, you know, not to have your voice recorded. And we're happy to, you know, happy for that. But before that, Violetta and then Dovile, your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much. So I will be very brief. I will just say that I myself contributed the chapters to the great edited volume collection of contributions. I wrote about securitization of memory and the practice of public history in the Baltic states. And listening now to the presentations and looking at the volume, I really would want to support the last point that Erica made. These different case studies from different parts of the world that very often, you know, to people who would be reading this book, students, you know, young scholars, experienced scholars, I bet you that to many of them, the parallels or the connections among different processes would not at all be clear. It's surprising, you know, how little, even here in Europe, we know kind of about each other's experiences, right? And yeah, what else can I say? It feels like so much has changed in global politics over the past few months and even the past few days, you know? And since the election in the US, I'm sorry I can't mention it, the logic of autocratic regimes, you know, pass, you know, quote unquote, come home, and practices of autocracy that we have seen in faraway places are kind of now being implemented in place that many of us here, I'm speaking from Vilnius, right, from Lithuania, have long admired as the heartland of democracy. So it also shows that, you know, we are watching news here very intensely, seeing what is happening, and the recent events related in Ukraine, and you know, it will be 3 years since the full-scale invasion on the 22nd, right? All of this has shown that that it's, yeah, the world is a rather brutal place where the strongest states, you know, want to prevail, and they impose their narratives on others. And yeah, it's important to look for ways to securitize, for the smaller states, to securitize national memory, or, you know, for groups that are to be suppressed or eliminated, to ensure that these more powerful narratives just do not walk all over them. So I really appreciated the contribution on resistance. I think Dovile may talk about this. We really can learn from different case studies. We need to talk to each other. We need to look at different examples, at different practices. And I want to take this opportunity to thank the editors of this great book for giving this opportunity. And I really hope that this conversation will continue, that we will continue cooperating and searching for, looking at different case studies, searching for different solutions, talking to each other. Thank you very much. And I give the floor to Dovile.
Thank you, Violetta. Dovile, floor is yours.
Right, thank you so much. Before I start, I'd like to recognize that in the audience there are two more authors who contributed to this volume, and that's Seina Nuthain Lemelson, who wrote a fascinating chapter about Myanmar, right? Very rarely do we see in memory studies this work. And also Claudia Tatar, and she wrote about Holodomor narratives. Also, obviously, given the current developments, extremely important to recognize a historical truth. So thank you both for joining us, and thank you everybody who's with us. I'll be very brief because I'm sure we'll have fascinating questions and comments from the audience, but I'm joining here from Atlanta, Georgia, and listening to the narratives about memory activism, right? And memory activism, public history, were always associated with a fight, for democracy. Today, when I listen to these stories from the United States of America, I keep thinking about resistance, and the question that I could not stop thinking about when I was listening to these presentations would be, what does it mean to stand on the right side of history, right? And it's very pertinent to me right here, right now. What do I do? How do I speak up for truth? How do I speak up for what's right? How do I find myself on the right side of history? And so therefore, these stories that Erica talked about, that Didam talked about, how important it is to stand up for historical truth, right? We talk a lot about memory securitization, but in many cases, mnemonic activism is also standing up for what those groups view as historical truth. And I think, especially given the comments of our President Trump about Ukraine, right, that Ukraine started the war, I think this need to focus on historical truth remains very pertinent today. So I'll stop right here.
Thank you, Dovile. So first of all, the floor is open. If anyone would like to ask, any questions, questions of our presenters. Thank you. So Federica has a question for Erica. I'll go ahead and read that since it was posted in the chat. I wonder if this movement of the Mothers of Akari was somehow shaped by the movement of the Argentinian Mothers of the Plaza de Mayo in Buenos Aires, Argentina, a similar place in history of Argentine modern history with the military dictatorship, activism, and historical truth. Thank you, Federica. Great question. Erica, you are muted.
Okay, now I can go ahead. Yes, at first one might think that the movement in Akari remodeled after them, but actually it did not quite happen that way, because during the military regime in Brazil, there was not much visibility of the mothers of in Buenos Aires here because of censorship. But as after 1988, which was already under the Brazilian democratic constitution, actually they sort of both leaders of both groups did have some exchange. And because sadly, the first leader of the Mothers of Korea was killed by military, a death squad, two of them actually, and the leader. And that kill actually brought more visibility to the group. And then in the late 1990s, the first lady of France that started, I can't recall which one. I want to say it was the first lady of France married to Jacques Chirac, but I'm not 100% now I can recall. But actually, she was the one that presented the leaders to each other from those both groups. So again, I think there's a dimension of gender, the role of mother, and even the discourse of having the right to bury your child is a strong one. It's and it resonates in Latin or Iberian audiences. So there's also this. I think it's the key there. The representation of what we call sociologists call a Marian element. So the notion of Holy Mary and her Jesus Christ, the same thing, the right of a mother to bury their a son or loved ones. It's a very strong one that resonates in Catholic audience, like in Brazil, Argentina, and even in France. So they only met further down the road, but they did.
Thank you. Stephen Christian, you have a question first. Stephen? Okay, perfect. We'll wait just a moment, for that. Okay, it's the mic doesn't seem to be working for you there. So if you want to go ahead and type that in, we have a question here. So I'll ask that question, then if you want to type your question, then we'll go to yours next. The question here is, to what extent are the respective countries going to erase or rewrite history for schools and universities to accommodate political leanings, as is the case in the United States? Fabrizio, let's start with you. How is this being represented? How is your case being represented in Colombia in sort of official textbooks, the way the way history is taught in the classrooms?
Thanks, Doug. Just good question. Very good one. If you bear in mind that people who participated in this 85 taking of the palace are still being persecuted, and some of them are, the case is still coming up. The short answer is there is an official version, mostly stimulated by the army, so firmly controlling the memory. But a number of exhibitions and the attempts of also on the state side to promote the memory of the other side of the story, not only the army, is starting to infiltrate, and there's I would say scholarly material that is transmitted by the new generations, but mostly via exhibitions or specific booklets that are transmitting different versions of the memory. So if the short answer is it's complicated, the long answer is we're still not sure how this is going to consolidate. So there is a dispute, yes. One version that's surely controlled by the Colombian State, the Ministry of Education, but the supplementary material is being also taken to the schools. As far as we can see, this is mostly stimulated by the commissions, not only one, but the commissions of the memory commissions that have been established.
And Dina, yours, has this unique case of, it's not a case that's all that well known, certainly in the West, though it became a bigger issue with the Russian annexation of Crimea. But how is this being presented in formal textbooks, and you can kind of choose whichever country you would like to make a reference to that.
Maybe I can talk about Crimean Tatar cause of, including their maybe remembering Crimean Tatar cultural and historical legacy in Crimea, because they claim that they are not just an ordinary minority group in Crimea. They are an indigenous nation of Crimea, and they say that after the deportation in 1944 and until their return after the Cold War, so half a century, Stalin and followers, they erased Crimean Tatar heritage, cultural monuments, even street names from the daily life of Crimea, so from the institutions of Crimea. So they are trying to take back, even return to their maybe cultural heritage and maybe erect their monuments again. And there are certain countries like Turkey, Ukraine, some Western countries who sponsor such projects of remembering the Crimean Tatar cultural legacy and monuments, commemoration, and their contribution to the Crimean history, civilization in this sense. So there are certain projects like that, and Turkey is actively contributing and sponsoring such projects, especially retrieving some photographs, visuals from the archives, and benefiting from oral stories about Crimean Tatar presence in Crimean past. Yeah.
Mm. And Dina, you actually raise a really interesting question I may circle back to about the role that international actors play, because we have a tendency to view this as something, quite specifically, and just domestic actors, but certainly international actors are playing a pretty key role. But I want to get to Stephen. Hopefully, the microphone has been fixed, and so
hi there. Can you hear me?
We can. Thank you.
Okay, good. Sorry, I was watching this through Chrome, and then the Omnibar didn't show any options to use the mic, and so I had to open up through the app. So I apologize. So I want to ask a broad question, but then sort of give y'all sort of the thoughts in my head about like why I'm asking this question. So you don't need to address the thoughts, but at least somebody address the question. So I want to know like the book or the chapters or maybe the literature on security and memory more broadly, what does it say in terms of talking about global economics or just just economic systems in general? The two things that come to my mind are how when we talk about economics and the securing of memory, it sort of opens up a lot of questions, at least for me, because when we talk about the economics, it's not just simply what is being remembered, but it's also who has access to distribute and to commodify that secured memory. Because in my mind, I'm thinking about academia, particularly in the US, but I think this applies mostly to several other universities outside of the US. The example I always think of is how I'm near University of Michigan. I teach for Georgia Gwinett, but I'm near the University of Michigan. And University of Michigan famously had protests in 2023, 2024, defending Palestine. And then I think about news stories about Colombia and the protests happening there. And the one thing that comes to mind of both Michigan and Colombia is that both of them have like rooms, programs, institutes named after Edward Said. And Edward Said, obviously a prominent figure in post-colonial thought and for the advocacy of Palestinians. Like, on one hand, it's like, that's a memory you would want to secure. Like, he is a foundational thinker, he's a profound thinker, but the universities that use it, they will secure it, but then the memory becomes commodified for the brand of the university, completely divorced from the hypocrisy of what they're doing to their own students that Said would have himself defended. So that's in my mind about like the economics of the security of or securitizing or trying to defend memory. But then the second thing that comes to my mind is how, the way y'all been talking about memory, it's a conscious thing. If I don't, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's largely a conscious thing. That is, it is human beings being able to recollect either the past or memories that we say of the past. But in my mind, that's not the only way to think about memory. Memory has a materiality to it. And in my mind, and nobody needs to actually actively remember the memory. In my mind, it's like if you talk about computers as data, we talk about that data as memory, that there is memory in the thumb drive or in the hard drive. And I think about this because in terms of economic developments, we are seeing the rise of generative AI, which is largely based on just scraping off memory and turning that memory into results for users. And in my mind, it's that there's sort of a blur between remembering and forgetting, that nobody has to actually remember like what this data actually is, what it says. No one actually needs to consciously remember it for the machine to work, but it has to exist. The memory has to exist. And that can still be used even when nobody actively remembers. And in my mind is when it comes to the securitization of memory, it's no longer just simply, can we have human beings remember the past or remember the truth about the past? Now we have to have questions about, well, what about quite frankly, bad faith transnational actors or corporations now commodifying the memory, using that and sort of, I guess you say, maybe reifying it in so much like the labor of this memory is now lost and it's being used for surplus value that corporations that did not do any work are profiting off of. The question I have is that as AI tech becomes much more powerful, what happens when the securitization of memory becomes the securitization largely of capital and information and not actually about actively remembering the past to, have a productive political future? Sorry.
Yeah.
Sorry, again,
No.
that was a lot of thoughts about a really direct question. I apologize.
Yeah, and there are actually, several questions, and the first one I want to ask, I think I'm going to throw this to Erica because, with you talked about class and gender and race, et cetera, who has access, to the memory and what role that class plays in in access to the memory was that was the first question that came out. I know you have some thoughts on that.
Well, let me take this I'm gonna try to unpack some of the stuff that you got out there. But the first thing I wanna say is that, and I not saying it I do not want to say it lightly. I know exactly what's going on in the American universities because I'm part of the ISA Academic Freedom. We're getting a whole bunch of academic freedom committees. We're receiving lots and lots of calls and complaints, reports, and we are trying to act on it. But I will be a little bold to say that this clash around content of classes, design of classes, and it's a very American thing. Because your question related to how the universities are, this question is not it doesn't travel well to other parts of the world, especially if I look into the Latin American experience. Now, for multiple reasons that I want to go, but I do acknowledge that, how critical thinking may survive in an environment that's pretty much now pressed towards, the logic of free markets. On the other hand, what the case I looked into, the Mothers of a Career, can tell us is about how there's something that impulses people to engage with memory politics, and I think that tells us the role of emotions. How working or the social practice around memory policy, how do we memorialize, celebrate, remember, forget? It brings about a cathartic effect that just free markets will never be able to produce or match that. So the emotional dimension of sharing memories of remembrance, it still makes people, go. Because what you see from my chapters, I'm talking about a very poor Black women, the outskirts. Most of them could not even write and read. Some of them did not even have national IDs, and they had to procure them before they were able to become politically active. They didn't have IDs. So I'm talking about a very disfranchised, historically disfranchised, minoritized, subaltern group. And still they were able to accomplish many, many things. So that tells, I think that tells us how strong is the drive to reach one, even the notion of I want to have the right to mourn, how strong it is. So the notion of there's an emotion there that drives us to this collective enterprise, which is how to collectively remember and celebrate and memorialize, especially atrocities. Having said that, I think one issue that you raised is it is now very global, and it's getting very fast, and it scares a lot of me, is artificial intelligence. How are we able to make memories if we are not even able to tell if those are true memories? So I'm talking about videos that are making up and images. So the falsification of those collective memories through AI, and they travel really, really fast with no control, no regulation. And that's scary. I don't even have a solution to that. I'm just pointing out that it will be a game changer, I think, to those of us working with memory study, the role of artificial intelligence and still the social media that still refuse to any kind of regulation. Well, just at some spots that I'm getting out there.
Oh no, absolutely. And with this, we're gonna we've come to the end, but I think there's a couple of just a couple of thoughts I'm gonna throw out there. First, part of what Erica just said, the idea of the emotional ties that we have to memory. I'm always struck by when parents like to ask their students, okay, what lies do they teach you in school? With the possible exception of some science questions, it's almost always history. What's the history that you've learned? Let me tell you what really happened. And so I think individuals have a remarkable ability to push back. Though I share Erica's concerns, it's a reminder of keeping the human, keeping the people in this, and to also reflect something Deauville had said, which is resistance. Memory, a lot of memory is about resistance. And so these dominant discourses, and AI could speed that up and drive that home. But those dominant discourses, I think it's essential that we view this also as a form of resistance, because one of the most powerful forms of resistance, I think, with memory is a group of people like Idem just highlighted. We're here. We exist. We may not be in your history books, but we exist. And so ultimately, I think this form of, keeping the human, keeping the forms of resistance, and reminding us that one of the most important parts of memory is lifting the invisibility of populations that are not in your history books. With that, a reminder, it's called Defending Memory in Global Politics. Mnemonical In Security and Crises. Here's the book. Of course, it's reflecting backwards. The editors are Erica Resende, Deauville Boudrité, and me. And the authors here, a number of authors here, wonderful case studies. I really hope, at a minimum, have your library buy the book, at this point, and make sure, make sure you pick that up, because yes, as Erica pointed out, it's a little over 3 years that we've been working, 3-4 years we've been working on this, a labor of love. It's one of the things I'm most proud of. And thank you all so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us, on the webinar, and thank you for all the contributors. Thank you for, for this project. It's been my honor.